Okay, let's get started. So I'm really excited to be presenting this webinar with so many of my colleagues, which is focused on this year's International Women's Day theme of embracing equity, and more specifically on building an equitable workplace. For those of you who are new to our webinars, we are Jones Chase, a firm of specialist employment lawyers. We act for a number of companies from PLCs all the way up to startups, all the way down to startups, and also some fantastic individuals. We have a very high success rate for looking after those that we represent. We are delighted to have you with us today. I would like to quickly introduce the team who will be speaking today. So first of all, we've got Dean.
Hi there.
Hi. First and second, we've got Shona.
Hello.
And we have Harriet.
Good afternoon, everyone.
And we've got Josephine.
Hi.
And we have Zainab.
Hi, everyone.
So first of all, in terms of the format for the webinar, if you would like to ask us any questions, please use the Q&A box and hit the anonymous button if you want to do so anonymously. If you don't mind your name being displayed, you can use the chat box, which we will be keeping an eye on. If you want the rest of the attendees to see what you are saying, please use the drop-down box to select all panelists and attendees, which is useful to keep the chat flowing. If you would like to speak live, please write this into the Q&A or chat box, and either myself or one of the others will unmute you. I should add that we are recording this webinar to allow us to distribute the webinar to those who couldn't make it today. So please bear this in mind if you are asking questions or participating on an anonymised basis. I must emphasise that the points we are covering today are not formal legal advice, so much depends on the facts of the case, and sometimes the approach that you take in one case is not the approach that you will take in another. Therefore, please do not rely on this webinar for legal advice, and do get in touch with us instead. Context and facts are very important. As a quick reminder, the information that we're covering today is accurate as at 4 p.m. on the 23rd of March 2023. Things are changing very quickly, so do drop us a line if you have any further questions. So we appreciate that everyone's time is precious, and we're definitely going to finish at 5 p.m. today at the latest, if not before. We do like helping people, so if you have any further questions or issues that you would like to discuss, please do get in touch with us. We would be delighted to have a chat with you. Lastly, if you find our content and advice useful or know of someone else that needs our help, please feel free to recommend us to others. We do love getting referrals. So on to the content of the webinar. This year's International Women's Day campaign theme was focused on embracing equity, with the aim of starting conversations about why equal opportunities just aren't enough, and how achieving true inclusion and belonging requires equitable action. So the words equity and equality are often used interchangeably. However, they are inherently different concepts. So if we start with a very basic definition of each word, equality means an individual or group of people being given the same resources or opportunities, which I guess saying in isolation sounds perfectly fair. However, equity recognises that each person has different circumstances and allocates the exact resources and opportunities needed to reach an equal outcome. Equity acknowledges that people don't begin life at the same place, and that circumstances can make it more difficult for people to achieve the same goals. Inequity affects many people, but most commonly, historically, it has marginalised communities such as women, people of colour, disabled people, the economically disadvantaged, and those from the LGBTQ+ community. The goal of equity is to change systemic and structural barriers that get in the way of people's ability to thrive. So in fact, one of the International Women's Day missions this year is to forge inclusive work cultures where women's careers thrive and their achievements are celebrated. And that is the general theme of our topics today. Now, throughout this webinar, as employment lawyers, we are focusing on equity in the workplace. And as this is our International Women's Day webinar, we'll discuss inequities that typically impact women. The team have put together a schedule of exceptionally interesting and topical subjects on the theme of building an equitable workplace, with practical ideas and solutions that employers may wish to consider. So I will now be handing over to them. And first up is Harriet.
Thanks very much, Jess. So yes, with that in mind, in terms of things that potentially do disadvantage women more than men in the workplace, I wanted to talk a little bit about sexual harassment. And the reason that I've chosen this topic is it's actually something that we are seeing quite a lot in practice still. So it's something I really wanted to focus on, and I'm going to look a little bit, sort of just a reminder as to what is sexual harassment, but then also the things that employers can be doing to try and prevent it, because it does seem still to be quite a prevalent issue in the workplace today. And then a couple of points on reform in terms of what the government might have in store to strengthen those rights. So just as a quick reminder, as you'll know, sexual harassment is unlawful under the Equality Act 2010, and it applies to employees, which has quite a wide definition. So it will encompass job applicants, employees, workers, and individuals who are self-employed, depending on the terms of their contract. So it's quite a wide definition. And the definition itself is where A, engages in unwanted conduct of a sexual nature, and the conduct has the purpose or effect of either violating B's dignity or creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive environment for B. And that is Section 26 of the Equality Act. So I just wanted to look at a few interesting points on that definition. Unwanted really means the same as unwelcome or uninvited. And it doesn't mean that the individual, the victim, has to have expressed some kind of objection before the conduct is deemed to be unwanted. And something that has been welcomed in the past or accepted in the past can become unwanted if the individual sort of changes their feelings about it. And it can just be a single incident. That in itself could be harassment. And it doesn't even have to be directed at the claimant, so the person who's complaining about it. It could be directed at somebody else, and they may witness it or overhear it. And something that seems to come up a lot in our cases is the fact that the harasser is in a more senior position to the victim really can be a relevant circumstance, because that's all about the power balance. And the effect is assessed from the victim's subjective viewpoint. So it doesn't matter whether the harasser actually intended to create this intimidating, hostile, etc. environment. The fact that they did is sufficient. But the flip side of that is whether it was reasonable for the conduct to be regarded as having that effect is an objective test. So if any offence is unintentional, there won't be any harassment if the victim is being kind of hypersensitive. So there is a bit of a balance in terms of what would be deemed to be that particular type of conduct. So looking now at what can employers do to try and prevent sexual harassment in the workplace, as is sort of fairly obvious, if you get complaints of sexual harassment, this can lead to really costly settlements. You can have high-profile departures of senior management, expensive litigation, loss of productivity, damage to reputation, even steep declines in share prices, and really big impacts on recruitment and employee retention. And when I was preparing this talk, I came across, reminded myself about the walkout at Google's offices in November 2018, which was in response to the handling of senior departures following sexual misconduct allegations and the fact that senior individuals received large payoffs and thousands of people walked out. It did then lead to an overhaul of Google's sexual harassment policy, but it just goes to show the impact that these things can have. And obviously, sexual harassment issues can also have regulatory consequences for regulated employers. So they're really important things for employers to take seriously. So in terms of some of the measures an employer can take, I think the place to start is really understanding the extent of the potential problem in their workplace and identify areas of risk. And it may be hard to create a workplace culture that minimises this risk of sexual harassment if the employer and the senior management team don't understand the extent of the current problem. And some research that was commissioned by the BBC in 2017 found that 40% of women and 18% of men out of just over 6,000 respondents had experienced some form of unwanted sexual harassment in the workplace. And this ranged from unwelcome jokes or comments of a sexual nature to serious sexual assault, which is a massive number of people that have experienced this. And interestingly, the Women Inequalities Commission report on sexual harassment in 2018 found that there was a lack of awareness at the most senior levels of employers about the extent of the sexual harassment. And other reports have shown that a large proportion of people who say they experienced it didn't actually ever report it to their employer. So this leads to a problem where those at the top who might be able to take action don't, as they're not aware of the extent of the problem because people aren't reporting it. So next question, why are people not reporting it? What are the barriers there? And again, there's been a lot of reports that have come up with these points. And the first one is the view that from individuals that raising the issue was essentially useless, as the organisation didn't take the issue seriously. So they just had no faith that anything would be done. And the employers of half the respondents to this particular survey reported that the respondents, that the employers took no action in relation to the sexual harassment that they'd suffered. And this sort of leads on to the belief that the alleged perpetrators, particularly senior staff, would be protected. And inexperienced, unsupportive managers, when they've reported it, fear of victimisation, so being worried that their career might be damaged if they pursued their complaint, or they might be disciplined or losing their job, which I think is a massive problem. And other people reported that they themselves were blamed for the harassment, or they felt punished because they were the ones that were moved to another department when the alleged perpetrator was left in their existing role, or people just not knowing how to report this kind of harassment in the workplace. So it's clear that many victims of sexual harassment would actually rather leave their employer than report the harassment to them. And I think employers should therefore focus on addressing these barriers, whether they do exist in their workplace, and really be encouraging victims to come forward and make it clear that potential perpetrators will not be protected, the conduct is unacceptable, and they're going to be sanctioned. And I think another point that's quite interesting is employers should consider asking an open question about experiences of harassment in their leaver interviews. And that can then give them quite a lot of information, because someone who's leaving the organisation anyway may feel a little bit more open about talking about their experiences. And studies have also found that the increase in remote working in response to COVID-19 has also increased instances of online sexual harassment of women via platforms used by employers to facilitate remote working, so Zoom, Teams, and other forms of social media. And a survey by the charity Rights of Women found that video calling had eroded privacy and safety by bringing harassers into their victims' home environment, including their bedrooms. And it also reported that victims felt less able to report harassment to their employers whilst working remotely. So an anonymous staff survey can be a useful tool to get insight into employees' views on the culture of the organisation and whether there are potential risk areas that need to be addressed. And you could also consider running focus groups, ideally with an external facilitator. It's important when we're talking about what the people at the top are doing to ensure that the leadership team is visibly setting out and openly communicating a zero tolerance approach to harassment in the workplace, and to encourage people to report the behaviour. And I think an important tool in doing this is having an effective anti-harassment policy. So this, many employers do have an anti-harassment policy, but it might not be something that is either regularly brought to employees' attention. You may not have, training on it regularly, or other things people can do is have anti-harassment week. So really bringing this policy to people's attention. And I think it should cover clearly what conduct is unacceptable, the fact that there's a zero tolerance approach, how employees can report conduct, what process will be followed, and what support is available for the victims of harassment, for example, an employee assistant programme. I think the training should be provided to all staff. So from induction onwards, it's often done at the beginning of the employment relationship, but not necessarily throughout the life of the employment relationship. So it should be refreshed at regular intervals, and also have specific training for managers in how to deal with complaints of harassment, because that's often a real issue and a stumbling block to people reporting. And also, if you have harassment training, make sure it's tailored to your particular industry. So it's useful, for example, if the employer was a call centre, to cover how you deal with abusive calls, or if you were a pub or a restaurant, how to deal with physical abuse in those kind of environments. So make sure it's really, really relevant for your workplace. And I think the way that managers deal with complaints, as I said, can be really sort of determinative in terms of how people feel about reporting. They should deal with it quickly, effectively, sensitively, and making sure that people feel that they will be protected from victimisation, because this has seemed to be one of the big barriers to reporting. And organisations can have nominated employees who maybe monitor harassment issues and offer the support. So having a sort of workplace champion, someone who's specifically trained in providing support to those who have experienced sexual harassment. It could be someone in HR, it could be someone else. And we're now finding there's more often than it used to that there are third parties working amongst employees in the workplace. There may be people from a different employer, there may be agency workers or subcontractors. And if you have these third parties in the workplace, you need to make sure that they understand that the company has a zero tolerance policy to sexual harassment. Because unfortunately, currently, the law doesn't adequately support those who are harassed by a third party. That law was changed a few years ago, and an employer currently is only liable in limited and exceptional circumstances for harassment of a third party. But there is a proposal for reform in this area, which I'll come on to shortly. And also make it clear to employees that harassment of all of those they come into contact with won't be tolerated. So if they come into contact with people who are not part of the organisation, because a harassment claim could be brought against the employer in its capacity as a service provider, for example, under Section 29 of the Equality Act, because anything done by the employee in the course of their employment is treated as having been done by the employer, regardless of whether the employer knew about that or approved of it. So make sure that your policies provide adequate protection to all the workers, including volunteers and interns, because not all of those are protected by the Equality Act. And lastly, to ensure effective monitoring of the number of claims that an organisation has, you could have things like requiring settlement agreements in sexual harassment claims to be signed off or reviewed at board level. It's important to keep confidential records of the number of sexual harassment complaints and the action taken, so you can refer back to this and really keep track on whether there's an issue within the organisation. And lastly, I'm just quickly looking at some proposals for reform in this area. You may have heard about the Worker Protection Amendment of Equality Act 2010 bill, it rolls off the tongue, which the government is supporting. It's a private member's bill which would create employer liability for third-party harassment that I've just referred to. So putting the law back actually a little bit better to how it was, but it would mean that employers would be more readily liable for third-party harassment, and also introducing a mandatory duty on employers to take all reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment of their employees. So an employer would be treated as harassing an employee when a third party, such as a customer or client, harasses an employee in the course of their employment, and the employer has failed to take all reasonable steps to prevent that harassment. And also the 25% uplift, which applies when there's currently breach of the ACAS Code on Discipline and Grievance Procedures, which you may know about. If the tribunal upholds a claim for sexual harassment and it finds an employer breached the duty to take reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment, it may order an uplift in compensation of up to 25% to reflect the employer's breach. So this bill has had its first reading in the House of Lords in early February. We're waiting for the next stage, but the Act would come into force a year after it's passed. So watch this space. It may be passed this year, and then we may see the law changing next year, and we can obviously update you then. And my very last point is just that following recommendations from the EHRC and the Women and Equality Select Committee, the government's confirmed its intention to introduce a statutory code of practice on sexual harassment and harassment at work, which will set out steps that an employer should take to prevent and respond to sexual harassment. So this should be really useful, and hopefully will be coming out at the same time as the law may be changed, as just discussed. So we've got a lot to get through, so I shall stop there, and I will hand back to Jess for our next topic.
Thank you very much, Harriet. I will now be handing over to Dean.
Okay, that's great, and thanks so much, Jess. So hello everyone, and today I'm going to speak about this phrase that's come out recently in the media: are women working for free for 2 months every year in the UK? And in line with the focus of the International Women's Day this year, the focus of my talk really is all about removing the gender pay gap within an organisation, and to provide a by no means exhaustive list of the ways that companies can take action to create a more equitable workplace in relation to pay. So very quickly, what is the gender pay gap? I'm sure we all know by now that the gender pay gap is the difference in the amount of money being paid to women compared to men for doing the same work, and women are indeed typically paid less. When I started as an employment lawyer 20 years ago in 2003, the gender pay gap at that point was 18%. And whilst of late there's some positive trends to report, there's still an awful lot of work to be done in this area. And in terms of the most recent stats, in December 2021, research was carried out by the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and that research found that working age women do essentially 50 more hours of unpaid work than men each month. So this is quite significant. And secondly, in February of this year, the TUC released an analysis of the 2022 ONS survey, which showed that in some age groups and regions, the gender pay gap means that women are indeed working for free for 2 months of the year. So that statement I mentioned earlier is indeed true. So looking at more specifics in terms of the stats. So with the recent ONS annual survey, the UK's gender pay gap in 2022 was 14.9%. And I'm pleased to say, at least over the last decade, the gender pay gap has fallen by approximately a quarter. And among full-time employees is now 8.3%, which is good, but obviously the gender pay gap still exists. And something else of note from all of this research and surveys is that between 2021 and 2022, it was found that the median weekly earnings increased by 6.6% amongst women, compared to a 4.8% increase for men. So that is good to see that women are getting paid more compared to men, and the trends are definitely getting better. What's also worth mentioning, and it's also one of the focuses of the Embrace Equity campaign, is the gender pension gap. And effectively, this is the difference between the pension pot of men and women when they retire. According to analysis carried out by Scottish widows, women aged between 65 and 74 will on average have pension savings worth £130,000, whereas men, on the other hand, will retire with £260,000 in their pot. And gender imbalances in pay, working patterns, and time out of work for childcare and caring responsibilities are the key drivers of the gender pension gap. Although the current decreasing trend of the gender pay gap, it does show a slight improvement in the outlook for younger women over the years, but the difference does, of course, remain very stark. And on average, a 25-year-old woman today will retire with £100,000 less than the man in her pension pot. So if you convert this to working years, then she'll have to work an additional 16 years to the age of 81 just to reach the same level of pension as a man. So the final part of my talk is to discuss about how do we go about fixing all of this. And the first thing that I'll say is that the fix can be done on an organization by organizational basis. And secondly, we will need action by individual people on a case-by-case basis in order to make the changes. And looking at all of the research and various reports, I tried to make it a top 10, but unfortunately there were 11 points. So this is a top 11 recommendations to get rid of the gender pay gap. So number one is monitoring. And the Equality and Human Rights Commission's Code of Practice on the Equality Act does have a section on monitoring. So basically monitoring people's pay levels. And whilst there's no general obligation to carry out monitoring, understanding your organization's gender pay gap can help HR executives and senior management focus their actions and deliver the most effective results. And there is an expression I quite like, which is you can't hit the target if you don't know what the target is. So carrying out workplace monitoring will really help to identify any inequalities within the workplace and where they lie. And then steps can be taken to remove the unfairness and the disadvantage, which I will deal with shortly. The second top tip is to make specific time-bound targets, basically saying what will be achieved and by when. And although general statements such as improving gender equity at our organization or reducing the gender pay gap across the organization are great overarching goals, they're not enough, they're not specific enough to create real accountability and tangible targets. So instead, employers should set specific time-bound goals that can be quantified, tracked, and have a set time frame. So for example, saying we will reduce our mean gender pay gap by 50% by 2025, or women will represent 30% of our senior management by 2030. That's far better than having a generic goal as your driver. You'll definitely get more done with a specific target. Another expression I like as well is if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. So that's something to bear in mind as well. And just another point on this is that the targets should be achievable, but of course, why not be bold and choose targets that encourage significant shifts in culture. And the third top tip is speaking to the individuals, just to make sure that you do raise your concerns, because some research has been carried out and it's commonly understood that women are far less likely to speak up about issues that are of concern to them in the workplace when compared to men. And historically, women have not asked for as much help as men in the workplace. So I think silence can be the biggest blocker to progress. So I would recommend each person to do speak up about issues that are concerned to them. And if you know of somebody who's being underpaid, whether you're male or female, speak up to management about it, and let's start affecting some change. Number 4, on the other side of that is, as an organization, you need to make sure that you listen to your staff. But not only listen, that you actually do something about it. A couple of quick points here as well is that you could carry out an anonymous survey of your staff to find out how easy it really is for them to raise issues that are of concern to them, and just to make sure that they don't fear repercussions for doing so. So following the survey, you can have a speaking up policy. This is different and less formal than a whistleblowing policy, and it's more likely to encourage participation. You could also have a drop-in HR clinic, for, perhaps one morning every quarter, every month even, with an open door policy, just to make it easy for people to come in and raise issues that are of concern to them. And of course, having a good equal opportunities policy is great as well. But if your staff do speak up about problems, definitely listen to them, and of course take action as well. The key thing is taking action and looking at where the problems are, speaking to managers that are making very bad or sexist decisions, and implementing training and giving them guidance. Moving very quickly on at number 5, employees should always carry out a review of their recruitment, promotion and pay processes to make sure they're fair and equitable. And that could include number 6, making sure that there's more than one female included in shortlist. Now, there's no time to go into it, but research has been carried out that having one female on the shortlist for promotion is actually quite detrimental. So try to include more than one woman where possible in shortlist for jobs. Number 7, another recruitment tool and to encourage equality is using skill-based assessment tasks in recruitment. So when you're looking for, can somebody do a job, employers should be asking candidates to perform tasks that they would be expected to perform in the job and the role that they're applying for. Number 8, employers should use structured interviews for recruitment and promotions, because whilst unstructured interviews have strengths and weaknesses, having a structured interview process is more likely to get rid of unconscious bias, because people or managers will ask the same questions in the same way in a predetermined order and format. And you're just more likely to get fair responses, or the response to be considered on a more fair basis by doing that. Number 9, you should encourage salary negotiations by showing salary ranges. Again, there's research been carried out to show that women are less likely to negotiate their pay. And letting people know what the salary range or the salary banding is can really help for people to push for a salary increase based on their competencies. Number 10, again, very quickly, carrying out frequent equal pay audits is a very important thing to do as well. Again, if you can't measure the problem, if you don't measure the problem, then you can't fix it. And lastly, very quickly, is for employees to consider normalize flexible working, because it's still the case that women have primary childcare responsibility. And if the company does embrace flexible working, it does allow more females to remain within the workplace, to move up to the management ranks, to get more senior and get paid more money. So this is a great way of getting rid of the gender pay gap as well. And to end on a positive note, it did take a global pandemic to do this, but we're now in a position where flexible working is far more normalized. So in summary, the gender pay gap still exists, but it is getting smaller, and provided individuals and organizations do take action about this, it will get smaller, continue to get smaller, and hopefully will be eradicated in the not too distant future. So that's all for me at the moment.
Thank you so much for that, Dean. So I'm now handing over to Zainab.
Thanks, Jess. So I'm going to be talking about menopause in the workplace, and specifically the government's response to the menopause report that was done by the Women and Equality Select Commission. So what was the purpose of this inquiry? The purpose was to kind of gather evidence on current work practices and consider views on whether existing discrimination legislation sufficiently protects workers who are going through the menopause, or whether more needs to be done. So as it stands, discrimination against workers going through the menopause is covered by the Equality Act, where it's connected to one of the existing 9 protected characteristics. So the ones that we usually see in respect of any menopause discrimination are age or sex or disability. So the report made a number of recommendations, and I'm going to be looking specifically at the workplace and equality recommendations. Obviously, it's what we do. And firstly, I'm going to start with some of the recommendations which have been taken forward. So the first one is the appointment of a menopause ambassador. So the report said that the government had kind of a key strategic role in helping businesses, and they should be leading the way in assisting on how to develop good practice on managing menopause in the workplace. So the government was asked to appoint a menopause ambassador to kind of work with businesses, stakeholders from businesses rather, with unions and advisory groups to encourage awareness, good practice and guidance for employers. So this was accepted, and it was in fact already promised last year when the report came out. And in practice, what's happened is that the government's appointed Helen Tomlinson as the menopause employment champion. The response envisages that the champion will spearhead a campaign outlining the benefits of recruiting and retaining menopausal workers. It's a DWP ministerial appointment, and Helen will report to DWP ministers at regular intervals. The second recommendation, which was accepted, is the introduction of a day one right to request flexible working. So flexible working, as Dean's already mentioned, for kind of gender pay gap issues, but also for menopause issues, was repeatedly brought up as evidence in the inquiry of it being particularly helpful for menopausal employees. So in 2021, the government had already committed to making the right to request flexible working a day one right. This report recommended that legislation was brought forward, in addition, the government was urged to issue some guidance encouraging employers to grant all reasonable requests for flexible working instead of placing the burden on the employee to justify why they were making the request. So unsurprisingly, this has been accepted because it was kind of already accepted in 2021, but there's no new timeline for when the legislation will be provided. And the government have said there may be new guidance, but there's been no firm commitment in that regard. The third recommendation, which has been accepted, is the publication of new guidance on the law. So despite there being an existing legal obligation under health and safety and equality laws, the report noted that neither the Health and Safety Executive or the Equality and Human Rights Commission had published any form of guidance on their website, specifically in relation to menopause. And the report recommended that both of those, the HSE and EHRC, publish new guidance on the legal considerations when supporting employees who are experiencing menopause. So the government's accepted the recommendation for the HSE to publish guidance. It has also referred to guidance that already exists on supporting disabled people and those with long-term health conditions, which can also potentially apply to menopausal workers. In respect of EHRC, that's an independent public body, so it's kind of up to them to decide what they want to do next. So what's been rejected? A lot, in short, but we'll go through kind of the main ones. So the first is the publication of model menopause policies. So when the inquiry was being conducted, there was evidence put forward as to whether workplaces should be legally required to have a menopause policy. The committee who prepared the report weren't persuaded that it would be necessary for every workplace to have a policy. However, what they did recommend that the government do was to produce a model menopause policy for employers. So that would cover, for example, how staff would request reasonable adjustments and other support, any advice on flexible working, and then kind of set out guidance for sick leave for menopausal employees. The government rejected this recommendation. It's pointed to kind of guidance that's published by the CIPD and ACAS and other initiatives kind of pursued by the government related to occupational health and women's health more generally. So the second recommendation, which was rejected, was for a large public sector employer to trial specific menopause leave. So the report kind of noted that menopausal symptoms have a significant and sometimes debilitating impact on women at work. We know there's a massive range on the symptoms you could potentially have, and these can often lead to periods of sickness absence. So the presence of kind of rigid absence, the presence of rigid sickness absence thresholds could trigger formal absence management processes, which could result in women potentially leaving the workplace. So to counter this problem, the committee said to the government, why don't you work with a large public sector employer with a strong public profile and try to develop and pilot a specific menopause leave policy and publish those proposals for a wider rollout kind of within 12 months of the commencement of the scheme. The government said no to this. They rejected that recommendation, saying that their policy aim is to support menopausal women remain in the workplace and to ensure that employers are well equipped to support their workforce during the menopause. The focus for them is on disseminating best practice and encouraging employers to implement menopause policies and other forms of support, such as flexible working. The report actually said that this idea of a large public sector employer trialing menopause leave could potentially be counterproductive, but there wasn't actually any specific reason provided as to why it would be counterproductive in achieving the government's goals. So the next recommendation, which was rejected, was the commencement of the dormant dual discrimination provisions in the Equality Act. So in the Equality Act, there are some dual discrimination provisions, specifically at Section 14. The inquiry considered that because menopause is essentially an intersectional phenomenon in that it mainly affects older women, so that's two of the protected characteristics, that potentially the dormant dual discrimination provisions could be enacted. That would entitle a worker to complain of discrimination arising out of a combination of two of the protected characteristics rather than one, which is presently what's available to everyone were they to bring a discrimination claim. So this change would specifically help menopausal workers who'd find it difficult to succeed with complaints that were just based on a single characteristic. The committee took a fairly robust approach to this issue, stating that the current law doesn't serve to protect menopausal women, and that Section 14 is, it's already there, it's shelf ready, it's written into legislation, it's just sleeping, it's dormant, and it should be commenced immediately. The government rejected the recommendation on the basis that if Section 14 was to be implemented, it would have to be done wholesale. So it couldn't just be enacted to cover sex and age. And the response would create potentially 12 dual protected characteristics in addition to age and sex. This is on the basis that pregnancy and maternity and marriage and civil partnerships are not covered by Section 14. So the government said that would place a significant additional burden on employers and service providers. I think the rejection of that recommendation is fairly unsurprising. I mean, it's a great idea, but it would be may well be problematic to kind of implement in reality. So the last one was a consultation on making menopause the 10th protected characteristic. So there was a lot of support for this on the basis that it would provide clear protection for those who are experiencing discrimination because of menopause. It was put forward that if a new protected characteristic were created, that would also include the duty to make reasonable adjustments in the same way that there is for disabled workers. Some of the evidence in the inquiry pointed to this disparity between the way pregnancy and menopause are treated in the workplace. So pregnancy is legally protected, menopause is not, even though all women, or pretty much all women will experience menopause, but not all women experience pregnancy. So it was asserted that introducing this new protected characteristic was not the best approach in addressing discrimination. The government pointed to alternatives such as expanding the duty to make reasonable adjustments, or expanding the definition of disability and or age discrimination provisions, but no commitment was made in respect of introducing those changes. The government said that they were rejecting the introduction of menopause as its own protected characteristic on the basis that there may well be some unintended consequences, such as discrimination towards men suffering from long-term medical conditions, or eroding some existing protections. And then it would be kind of a major undertaking, which would necessarily be some years away. So in conclusion, 3 recommendations were kind of accepted, which were, from my view, kind of existing commitments that had already been made. The extension of the right to request flexible working is a right to request. It's not a right to have. Obviously, it's helpful that it's now will at some point when the legislation is dealt with, will be a day one right. Whereas the other 2 changes amount to kind of introductions of guidance only and advice only. The chair of the committee, the Women Equality Select Committee, said that this was a missed opportunity, and it left her unconvinced that menopause is a government priority. I'd say also, to try and end on a much lighter note than the course of the last 10 minutes that I've been through with you, there is still recourse, obviously, for employees or for people who suffer discrimination as a result of going through the menopause via the other protected characteristics. And in addition, even though the government has said that they are not going to be publishing a model policy on this is something we have done for a number of our clients. So if you are interested in putting in place a menopause policy, which could do great things for the protection of workers and employees who are going through the menopause, that's something we can definitely do for you. And that's it from me. Thanks, Jess.
I was just going to say something. It'd be interesting to see what comes out in case law on this, Zainab.
Yeah, they will. I totally agree.
There's been quite a lot of case law under each heading at the moment at the preliminary stages, and all I would say it's about 95% success rate for the women that are bringing the cases. But the examples of what's gone on, they're extraordinary. What has been said to particular individuals in the workplace. So claims have been mostly for harassment. Then there's been age discrimination and disability discrimination, and then the harassment was on grounds of sex. So
yeah, I think that they're not introducing the model policies or requiring there to be a policy in place to protect menopausal workers is probably the one that I think is most problematic, just because having that policy in place means that people are already thinking about it, that they're aware of it, and there's some kind of outline set out on how to deal with it. I do kind of understand not introducing it as a protected characteristic, and it is, it's potentially covered quite well by the other ones. But I do think that's a missed kind of opportunity. That is where the missed opportunity is, really, because the only way people are going to know about it is if they know about it, and that's how employers will deal with it properly, I guess. Yeah,
so this could begin as more judgment law than statute.
Yeah, totally.
Not begin, bad choice of words, but it evolve or develop more. I think that there's definitely a huge shift now in favour of protecting people, isn't there? So in this regard.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Zainab, for your section and for your comments, Shona and Dean. Last but by no means least, I'm going to hand over to Josephine.
Thanks, Jess. Hello, everybody. I'm going to talk about redundancy whilst on maternity or parental leave. And so I thought I'd look at the numbers, a little bit about the human experience, the current law, and changes which are afoot to make the law more equitable in this area. So the figures for women taking maternity leave each year is around 650,000 in the UK. The number of couples who are exercising their right to take shared parental leave instead of pure maternity leave sit at around 13,000 couples a year. So we can see that the uptake on shared parental leave sits at around 2%. So redundancy, while on some form of parental leave to care for newborn children, is by and large still very much a women's issue. Everyone has a different experience of their maternity leave. I've had 2 periods of leave to look after my babies, and in my personal experience, it was a time when I felt all the feels. You're sort of desperate for a break from work because of the physical demands of pregnancy. Then you're also suddenly untethered from a structure to your day that, for me, I had operated under for nearly 20 years. You're plunged into this crazy new world, which is totally foreign to you. Many women experience postnatal depression. Most of us experience sleep deprivation to a level that you've never experienced before. And then at the same time, you're sort of overjoyed and wrapped up in love for your newborn baby, and you want to stare into their eyes and take loads of pictures and post them on Instagram and send them to all your family. So to be sort of put at risk of redundancy during this time is extremely destabilizing, because life as you know it has already completely turned upside down. And as a lawyer, when I've spoken to clients of this experience, what they all largely report is they felt robbed of the special one-on-one time that they were supposed to have bonding with their baby has been usurped by the fact that they're stressing out about losing their job, the impact that redundancy could have on their career as a whole, how their family's going to function without that source of income. And even the little things like scheduling the necessary meetings with HR become massively daunting tasks, because you just don't know when your baby is going to sleep and for how long. But this is the reality for many women in the UK, and BEIS's most recent research on this a couple of years ago was that 1 in 9 women were pushed out of their jobs whilst they were on maternity leave. And that was about 52,000 a year, having been dismissed for redundancy whilst on maternity leave in 2020. So what is the law? I mean, many of you will know, of course, that it's lawful to make a woman redundant on maternity leave, but that is subject to the requirements of Regulation 10 of the Maternity and Parental Leave Regulations 1999. This applies where during an employee's maternity leave or any period of shared parental leave or adoption leave, where it is not practicable for the employer to return them to their role because of redundancy, where there is a suitable alternative role, the employee who's on the leave is entitled to be offered that role if the work is suitable and appropriate for them to do and the terms are no less favourable than their previous role. And if an employer does not do this, then the dismissal for redundancy will be an automatic unfair dismissal. So the fundamentals here are you don't have to create a role, it's just if one exists, then she has to be offered it, not offered a chance to go for it. And if there is any competing to be done between staff for that role, it can only be between staff that are also on maternity, shared parental or adoption leave. So this is protective legislation that prioritises women and parents on leave over others at risk in securing an ongoing employment. So it's an example of an equitable rather than an equal policy, as it's there to level the playing field, essentially. But as practitioners, we've found this legislation does not close the equity gap enough. First, it does not cover women who are pregnant and yet to go on leave. Women who are pregnant during redundancy consultations are not permitted to be made redundant because of their pregnancy or a reason relating to it, like illness or their intention to take future leave. But there's no priority for them in seeking re-employment before they start their leave. Now, without being too cynical here, you can see how some employers might capitalise on this vulnerability. Second, once a woman has returned from maternity leave, she has very little protection at all and no priority for alternative employment on her return. And as an employment lawyer, I would say that this is the typical case that I get where a woman has had her maternity leave, she returns, and this is when it starts to go wrong, and she really has to fight to get back to where she was before she took leave. And that seems to manifest in things like key clients having been handed over during her maternity leave, and then for sort of continuity for the client, that client's not passed back. Or direct reports have gone across to another member of the team to manage, and because she's returned partway through the performance management year, then for the continuity of the employee, those employees are not handed back for her to manage. Or key parts of the role or responsibilities or functions have been divided up amongst peers, and for whatever reason, those are yet to be passed back. So now, if you've been divested of important functions, direct reports and key clients, even the best intentioned employer who devises a fair selection criteria in a redundancy process that measures a broad range of facets across the business, for the woman who's returned from maternity leave, she will often find that she falls short when compared with other staff who have not had leave, because her role has been eroded in these sort of subtle ways. Women in this position who go on to be made redundant after their leave are left with arguing really complicated cases of indirect sex discrimination, which have all sorts of tricky issues in relation to comparators and strict time limits. This is an ambulance way down the cliff solution. What she really needed was for it to be recognised at the outset of the process that she is in a more vulnerable position when it comes to redundancy, because she has had an extensive period of time out of the business. So this is where the Protection from Redundancy Bill seeks to make things more equitable again for women in redundancy processes. The bill means that women are prioritised for re-employment into suitable alternative roles from the date they notify their employer of their pregnancy and up to a period of 6 months after they return from leave, which crucially means they have a little bit more time to get their feet under the desk before they have to competitively compete with colleagues for the sort of few remaining opportunities in the business. Is it equitable enough? Not according to many sort of action groups like Pregnant Then Screwed. But I thought it might be interesting to look at how it's approached in other countries. And I came across the example of France. And in France, there's a total ban on dismissal during maternity leave, even for redundancy. You can't even start a consultation with the woman who's on maternity leave. Then on return, a woman is protected from dismissal for a further 10 weeks, and dismissal is only permitted if she's committed gross misconduct or where it's impossible to maintain the contract. That sounds a little bit like redundancy, but the economic rationale for the dismissal cannot be a legitimate basis for the dismissal. So that precludes nearly all redundancies other than sort of widespread office closures and liquidations. So it was interesting just to see that there's this full protection during maternity leave and sort of some protection after, whereas we have some protection during mat leave and soon to have some protections for 6 months after. Yeah, there we have it.
Thank you so much for that, Jo. That was so interesting. Obviously, comparing that to other countries. I don't believe that we've had any questions in. I don't know if anyone's got any questions that they would like to ask. If so, please do go ahead and put it in the Q&A boxes. Did anyone else have anything to add to their section or to someone else's section?
Actually, I'm going to comment on Josephine's section. I thought the French example was very interesting too. I think when the period of maternity leave was extended to 1 year, that's when it would have been right and proper to have introduced this protection that they're now talking about for the return, because no account has been taken of the fact that businesses change a lot in a year, and they leave a woman that has taken the whole year off for maternity leave, which is her right to do so, then left in a very vulnerable position in that changing year that they've been off. When maternity leave was a much shorter period of time, there were fewer changes that were taking part in the business. And actually, when you came back, people were usually extremely pleased to see you because nobody had covered what you were doing for the 3 months that you were off. So in my view, the law that's being suggested now ought to have been suggested when maternity leave was extended to 1 year, and it's too late in coming, and we've got a lot of employers that think that they can get away with changes. So yeah, I think it's a good piece of legislation to bring in, but it's way too late.
Now, I did promise that we were going to finish at 5, and it is 5 o'clock. So as a quick reminder, the information that we've covered today is accurate as of 4 p.m. on the 23rd of March 2023. If you have any further questions, do drop us a line. All of our contact information can be found on our website, which is joneschase.com. Thank you very much for attending.